They tell you it's a curse. They tell you it's a monument to failure, a 900 bale tombstone for a town's dead industry. They point to the mountain of refuse left behind by the Abernathy wool mill, a greasy, compressed mass of shoddy and scrap rotting under the high desert sun, and they call it your inheritance. Not the land, not the quiet ranch house your husband built with his own 2 hands, but this. This blight. A problem so large it has its own shadow, a shadow that creeps across your property line each afternoon like a stain. They say a lone woman, barely 25 and new to the sting of widowhood, can't possibly move a mountain. They are wrong. This is the story of how that curse became an empire, how 900 bales of garbage became the foundation of a fortune, built one shovelful of dust and determination at a time. June 14, 1888. The dust never settled. It was the first thing Eleanor Vance learned about the valley after Thomas brought her here as his bride, and the last thing she remembered before the world went quiet after his accident. The dust was a constant, a fine, reddish powder that coated every surface, found its way through the tightest window sash, and settled in the lines of your hands. Today, it rose in a lazy plume from the hooves of a single horse approaching the ranch house. Eleanor watched from the porch, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of lukewarm coffee. The rider was Mr. Sterling from the Redemption Bank and Trust. He rode a tidy bay gelding and sat stiffly in the saddle, a man more comfortable with ledgers than with livestock. He wore his town coat despite the climbing heat, a dark blot of formality against the bleached canvas of the landscape. She didn't stand when he dismounted. She just watched him tie his horse to the hitching post Thomas had set last spring. He'd sunk it deep, tamping the earth with a rhythm that was like a heartbeat. The memory was so sharp it felt like a physical blow. Mrs. Vance Sterling's voice was dry as the dust he kicked up with his polished boots. He removed his hat, revealing a pale forehead untouched by the sun. Mr. Sterling. He held a folded document in his hand. He didn't offer it to her, not yet. His eyes drifted past her, toward the low, sprawling mass that squatted on the horizon just beyond her fence line. The Abernathy Bales. From here, it looked like a herd of giant, sleeping beasts, grey and misshapen. The town council had its final meeting on the Abernathy matter, he said. He wasn't a cruel man, Eleanor knew. He was a man of columns and sums, of assets and liabilities. He saw the world as a balance sheet, and she was currently on the wrong side of it. The mill property officially reverts to the township due to Abernathy's default and departure. However, the residual materials were dumped on the easement that borders your land. Eleanor said nothing. She already knew this. The whole town of Redemption knew it. They'd been talking about it since Abernathy packed his bags in the dead of night 2 months ago, leaving behind debts, an empty mill, and that colossal pile of waste. The council has declared it a public nuisance and a fire hazard, Sterling continued, his gaze still fixed on the bales. As the adjacent landowner, responsibility for its removal falls to you. He finally held out the paper. Her hand was steady as she took it. The ink was stark and official. It gave her 90 days. 90 days to remove 900 bales of compacted wool waste, each weighing close to 500 pounds. Failure to comply would result in fines, and the fines, she knew, would be followed by foreclosure. The bank held the note on the ranch. This was a clean, legal way of pushing her out. "Remove it to where, Mr. Sterling?" she asked, her voice quiet. "That is not the council's concern." He cleared his throat, a small, uncomfortable sound. "Most men would sell the acreage for a loss, let the next man deal with it. It's a considerable undertaking." He was offering her an out. An easy, ruinous out. Sell the land Thomas had bled for, the home he had built for her. Walk away with pennies and start over somewhere else, as someone else. She folded the paper, the crease sharp and definite. "Thomas and I, we don't walk away from a considerable undertaking." She used the present tense without thinking. "A painful habit." Sterling's expression was one of mild, professional pity. He saw a grieving girl playing at being a rancher's wife, lost in a world too big for her. He saw a liability. Be that as it may, the deadline is firm. 90 days. The 15th of September he placed his hat back on his head, the gesture a clear dismissal. "Good day, Mrs. Vance." She watched him ride away, the dust swirling behind him until he was just a dark speck disappearing back toward town. She looked at the paper in her hand, then at the mountain of refuse. 900 bales. £450,000 of someone else's problem. Her problem now. The sun beat down, and for the first time since Thomas's death, the heat felt less like warmth and more like pressure, pressing in on her from all sides. She didn't weep. Tears were a luxury, a waste of water in a land this dry. She simply stood on the porch, the silence of the ranch amplifying the roar of the impossible task ahead. She didn't know then that the man who had just handed her a death sentence for her home would one day come to her, hat in hand, asking for a loan. June 20th, 1888. Her father, Jebediah, arrived 3 days later. He rode in on his old mule, his face a road map of worry etched by 60 years of hard sun and harder luck. He'd been a rancher his whole life, and he knew the brutal arithmetic of this land. He'd seen a dozen families broken by drought, by disease, by the simple, grinding weight of the work. He sat at the small kitchen table Thomas had made, his big, calloused hands looking out of place against the delicate porcelain of the cup Eleanor had set for him. He'd read the notice from Sterling, his lips moving silently, as if tasting the bitter words. "You can't do this, Ellie," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It's not possible. It'd take a crew of 10 men with a steam tractor a month to shift that much weight. You're one woman." "I have the mules," she said, her voice more stubborn than she felt. "The mules can't haul away a mountain," he sighed, the sound heavy with the weariness of a man who had fought too many losing battles. "Sterling's right about one thing. You sell. You take what you can get for the deed, and you come back home with me. This is no place for you now." "This is my home," she said, the words fierce. "Thomas built it. Thomas is gone." The words were not unkind, but they were true, and they landed like stones. You can't honor a memory by killing yourself on it. That night, unable to sleep, Eleanor lit a lantern and went into the small study Thomas had used. It still smelled of him and of leather, and dust, and the faint, clean scent of cedar shavings. On his desk, next to a stack of agricultural pamphlets, was his work notebook. She ran her hand over the worn leather cover. It was filled with his neat, blocky handwriting. Notes on crop rotation, sketches of irrigation ditches, calculations of feed costs, observations on the weather. It was the physical record of his mind, of his dreams for this place. She sat and began to read, page by page, immersing herself in his thoughts. It was a way of having him back, just for a little while. Near the back of the book, on a page dated a month before he died, she found a hastily scrawled entry. It was different from the others, less a plan and more a stray thought. Spoke to Abernathy at the mill. Complaining about the shoddy. Mountains of it. Says it's nothing but greasy, tangled scrap. Useless. He just dumps it. But wool is wool. Full of nitrogen. Lanolin. Good for the soil, maybe? Slow release. Might hold water. Could be good for the dry patch up on the North Ridge. Worth a look. Eleanor read the entry again. And again. Good for the soil. The idea was a tiny spark in a vast darkness. A foolish, desperate spark. The bales weren't just a problem to be removed. They were a resource to be used. Her father saw a mountain to be moved. Sterling saw a liability to be cleared. Thomas, even in a passing thought, had seen potential. The next morning, before the sun had crested the eastern ridge, Eleanor took a wheelbarrow, a pitchfork, and a heavy-bladed axe and walked out to the edge of the great pile. She stood before a single bale. It was taller than her waist, bound tight with thick iron wire. The outer layer was sun-bleached and brittle, but underneath, the compressed wool was dark and dense. It smelled faintly of sheep, machine oil, and slow decay. It took her 20 minutes of hacking and prying with the axe just to snap one of the wires. It sprang loose with a vicious twang, narrowly missing her face. The bale seemed to exhale, swelling slightly as the pressure was released. She attacked the other wires, and when the last one gave way, the bale fell apart into a dense, lumpy mattress of felted wool. It was filthy work. A fine, greasy dust filled the air, coating her skin and catching in the back of her throat. The material was a chaotic tangle of short fibers, clippings, floor sweepings, and bits of raw, unwashed fleece. It was exactly what Abernathy had called it, greasy, tangled scrap. She spent the rest of the morning breaking up the clods with the pitchfork, her arms and back screaming in protest. By noon, she had a pile of loose, fluffy, foul-smelling material. She loaded it into the wheelbarrow, load after load, and carted it to the small vegetable patch behind the house. The soil there was hard-packed and pale, capable of producing only the most stubborn, stunted plants. She worked the shoddy into the earth, turning it over and over with a shovel, mixing the dark, greasy fibers with the dry, lifeless dirt. The work was exhausting, brutal. Her hands were raw inside her gloves. Sweat stung her eyes and carved clean channels through the grime on her face. Her father found her there in the late afternoon, covered head to toe in filth, her face set in a mask of grim determination. He looked at the broken bale, at the freshly turned patch of earth, and at her. He didn't say a word. He just shook his head slowly, the movement full of a deep, sorrowful pity. That evening, he left. "I'll be back in a week," he said. "Think about what I said, Ellie. Please." She watched him go, feeling a profound sense of isolation settle over her. The whole world thought she was a fool. Maybe she was. She looked at her hands, already blistering. She had 899 bales to go. She nods once, the way a man nods at a fence post he's just set. It's not an agreement or a surrender. It's an acknowledgement of the work that lies ahead. July 15, 1888. For a month, Eleanor's life found a new, punishing rhythm. Dawn, coffee, stale bread, and the long walk to the mountain of Bales. Morning, the brutal, repetitive violence of breaking a bale apart. The snap of the wires, the grunt of effort as she drove the pitchfork into the compacted mass, the choking dust. Midday, hauling the loosened material, her muscles screaming with every push of the wheelbarrow. Afternoon, working the shoddy into new sections of land, expanding her experimental plot foot by painful foot. Evening, collapsing into bed, too tired to cook, too sore to dream. The town watched. From a distance. Riders on the main road would slow their horses, staring at the lone figure toiling beside the mountain of waste. At the general store, conversation would hush when she came in to buy flour and beans, her face smudged with dirt and her hands wrapped in fresh bandages. They called it Vance's folly. They saw her not as determined, but as deranged by grief. Mr. Sterling paid his second visit exactly 1 month after the first. He found her not on the porch, but out in the field, turning over the soil. She was thinner, her skin burned brown by the sun, but her eyes were clear and direct. "Mrs. Vance," he said, staying on his horse this time. "I trust you're making progress on the removal." His tone was skeptical. He could see the mountain, and it looked largely untouched. She had managed to break down and incorporate perhaps 30 bales. A heroic effort for one person, but a pittance against the whole. 870 remained. "I'm making progress," she said, leaning on her shovel. He gestured with his chin toward the worked earth. "You seem to be burying it more than removing it." "It's a method of disposal," she replied, her voice even. He looked at the barren, dark brown patch of earth she had created. It looked ugly and strange against the pale, sun-baked land around it. A peculiar one. "The deadline stands, Mrs. Vance. 60 days remain." He turned his horse and left without another word. He did not see, or did not care to notice, the tiny, tender green shoots that were just beginning to poke through the surface of the original test plot. They were corn sprouts. And they were the deepest, healthiest green Eleanor had ever seen. A week later, her father returned. He brought supplies and a heavy heart, prepared to find her defeated and ready to give up. Instead, he found her on her knees in the garden patch, staring at the rows of thriving plants. The corn was a foot high, the beanstalks thick and vigorous, climbing the trellises she had made from scrap wood. The difference between the treated soil and the untreated soil just a few feet away was stark. It was the difference between life and mere existence. Jebediah walked the perimeter of the patch, his boots silent in the soft, dark earth. He knelt down, crumbling the rich soil between his fingers. It was moist, loamy. It held the morning dew long after the surrounding ground had cracked in the heat. He looked at the burgeoning plants, then at the mountain of Bales, then at his daughter. He saw the fire in her eyes, the raw blisters on her hands, the unshakable set of her jaw. He saw not a grieving widow, but a farmer. He didn't say, "I was wrong," he didn't say, "I believe in you." He walked to his mule, unstrapped his own shovel and pitchfork from the pack, and walked back to where she was working. "Show me how you break the wires without taking your eye out," was all he said. Music cue, a spare, quiet melody on a single acoustic guitar begins, conveying a sense of weary but resolute hope. The work was still brutal, but it was no longer solitary. Two sets of shoulders strained against the task instead of one. The sound of two shovels turning earth replaced the sound of one. They worked in a shared, exhausted silence, communicating in nods and grunts. Jebediah was older, his movement slower, but he had a lifetime of conserving energy, of knowing the precise angle to set a lever, the exact way to use his weight. He taught her how to work smarter, not just harder. They cleared another 60 bales in 2 weeks. The cultivated plot grew, a dark, fertile scar on the pale land. And the plants in the original patch flourished, their growth almost unnervingly rapid. They were a living testament to the truth of Thomas's scribbled note. It was not garbage. It was potential. It was life, waiting to be unlocked by labor. But the deadline loomed, and the mountain, though shrinking, still seemed impossibly large. She was turning a curse into a garden, but a garden wouldn't save her from the bank. She needed to turn it into a business. And she had no idea how. She only knew the work. She didn't know that her first customer was watching her from the next ridge over, his own fields turning to dust. August 22, 1888. Samuel Bishop was a man on the verge of ruin. His ranch bordered the Vance property to the north. For 3 generations, his family had run cattle on that land, but years of overgrazing and a persistent lack of rain had left his pastures barren. His soil was alkaline, his cattle were thin, and the bank, Mr. Sterling's bank, was sending him letters that were polite in tone and terrifying in their implication. He had watched Eleanor Vance's project with the same derisive curiosity as everyone else. Vance's folly. The mad widow burying trash. But as the summer wore on, he couldn't ignore the evidence of his own eyes. From his porch, he could see the vibrant, almost impossibly green rectangle that was growing on her land. His own fields were a study in brown and yellow. Pride is a hard thing to swallow, especially for a man who has never had to ask for help. But desperation is a powerful solvent. One afternoon, he rode over. He found Eleanor and Jebediah sacking the loose, processed shoddy into empty grain sacks. They had devised a system: one person broke the bale, the other sifted it for rocks and compacted lumps, and then they sacked it together. The air was thick with the familiar greasy dust. Bishop sat on his horse for a long moment before speaking. "Vance," he said, nodding at Eleanor. He'd known her husband, but barely knew her. "Jebediah." Jebediah nodded back. Eleanor stopped her work, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of a filthy glove. "Heard you were gardening," Bishop said, the word sounding inadequate. "Something like that," Eleanor said. He gestured toward her field. "My north pasture's gone to salt and dust. Can't grow a thing." "Nothing." He paused, his gaze fixed on the sacks. "What you're putting in those bags. Does it work?" "It does," she said. No sales pitch. No exaggeration. A simple statement of fact. He chewed on his lip. "What do you want for a sack?" Eleanor looked at the sack at her feet. It was heavy, 50 pounds of her sweat and pain. What was it worth? She had no idea. She thought of the numbers in Thomas's notebook. He was always calculating costs. The cost of seed, of feed, of time. Her costs were her own aching muscles, the price of flour and beans, the looming threat of foreclosure. 50 cents, she said. The number felt both ridiculously high and insultingly low. Bishop didn't flinch. 50 cents was half a day's wages for a hired hand, but a bargain if it could save his pasture. I'll take 10 sacks. To start. Jebediah helped him load the sacks onto his wagon. Bishop handed Eleanor $5 silver. The coins were heavy and real in her palm. It was the first money she had earned since Thomas died. It was the first proof that this was more than just a desperate attempt to survive. It was a business. She held the coins tightly, the metal cool against her skin. It felt like a key. As Bishop drove away, Jebediah looked at her. He nods once, the way a man nods at a fence post that he knows will hold. The news of Samuel Bishop's purchase traveled through Redemption with the speed of gossip. Vance's folly was now Vance's fertilizer. The whispers in the general store changed from pity to curiosity. When, 2 weeks later, a faint green haze began to show on Bishop's north pasture, that curiosity turned into genuine interest. Other ranchers and farmers started to arrive. They came tentatively at first, buying a few sacks to test on their own stubborn plots of land. A German wheat farmer named Schmidt, whose yields had been declining for years. A young couple trying to start a vegetable farm on a patch of rocky ground near the creek. Each came with skepticism, and each left with a wagon heavier than when they arrived. Eleanor set up a proper workstation. She used old timbers from a collapsed shed to build sorting tables and a bagging funnel. She painted a crude sign on a piece of scrapwood, Vance Soil Renewal. 50 cents a sack. The money trickled in. Dollars and coins collected in a tin box under her bed. It wasn't a flood, but it was a steady stream. Enough to buy better food, new work gloves, and liniment for their aching backs. More importantly, it was enough to fuel a flicker of hope. The deadline was now less than 3 weeks away. They had processed and sold over 200 bales. Another 100 had been worked into her own expanding fields. But more than 500 still remained. The mountain was smaller, but it was still a mountain. The work was still overwhelming. The shadow of foreclosure still loomed. She was selling the solution, but she hadn't yet solved her own problem. September 15, 1888. The final day arrived with a clear, unforgiving sky. The air was cooler, hinting at the coming autumn, but the sun was still bright, illuminating every detail of the Vance ranch. It illuminated the lush, thriving fields, a patchwork of deep green and gold that stood in defiance of the surrounding landscape. It illuminated the neat stacks of filled sacks, awaiting pickup. And it illuminated the remaining mountain of bales, a shrunken but still formidable testament to the work that remained. Eleanor had been awake since before dawn, not working, but preparing. She had washed her face and hands until they were clean, braided her hair neatly, and put on her best dress, a simple calico that she had last worn to church with Thomas. She and Jebediah sat at the kitchen table, a ledger book open between them. The columns were filled with her neat handwriting, tracking every sale, every expense. At the bottom of the page was a final sum. At precisely 10 o'clock, Mr. Sterling arrived. He was not alone this time. The town sheriff, a portly man named Gable, rode beside him. They stopped their horses at the edge of the cultivated land, their expressions unreadable. Eleanor met them on the porch. She did not invite them to sit. Mrs. Vance, Sterling began, his voice formal. Today is the day stipulated in the notice. I'm aware, she said. His eye scanned the property. He saw the changes. The vibrant fields, the organized workspace, the remaining bales. He was a man of numbers, and he was doing a quick, silent calculation. He saw progress, but he also saw a clear failure to meet the legal requirement. The nuisance had not been fully removed. You have made a commendable effort, he said, the words carefully chosen. A truly remarkable effort. However, the terms of the notice were explicit. The materials were to be removed entirely. They have not been. Sheriff Gable shifted his weight in his saddle, his hand resting on his belt. He was not a man who enjoyed this part of his job. The fines are now due, Sterling said, pulling a document from his coat. And with the failure to comply, the bank must now begin proceedings to. How much is the fine? Eleanor interrupted, her voice calm and steady. Sterling blinked, momentarily thrown off his script. $100. A significant sum. And how much do I currently owe on the mortgage for this ranch? Sterling frowned, consulting his own thoughts. The outstanding principal is $854. Eleanor turned and went back inside the house. Jebediah watched Sterling and the sheriff, his expression like granite. A moment later, Eleanor returned. She carried the tin box. She walked up to Sterling's horse and opened the box. It was filled with coins and folded banknotes. Here is $100 for the fine, she said, counting out the money into his hand. His eyes widened slightly. And here, she continued, counting out another pile of bills and coins, is $154. A payment against the principal of the loan. She closed the box. I will be at the bank on the 1st of every month to make a payment. From now on, I'll be paying ahead of schedule. There was a long, profound silence. The only sound was the wind rustling the leaves of the tall corn stalks in her field. Sheriff Gable slowly let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Mr. Sterling looked at the money in his hand, then at the woman before him. He saw the calluses on her hands, the exhaustion in the fine lines around her eyes, and the absolute, unyielding strength in her gaze. He was a man of assets and liabilities, and for the first time, he understood that he had fundamentally miscalculated the primary asset of this ranch. It wasn't the land, or the house, or the water rights. It was her. He slowly, carefully, folded the money and placed it in his coat pocket. He took the foreclosure notice, tore it neatly in half, and then in half again, letting the pieces fall to the dust. That will not be necessary, Mrs. Vance, he said. His voice was different now. Stripped of its condescension, it held a note of something that sounded almost like awe. However, it appears you have a thriving enterprise here. An enterprise that could grow much faster with proper capitalization. He leaned forward slightly in his saddle. Have you considered a business loan? To hire men, purchase more wagons? Your production is limited by your labor. We could change that. Eleanor looked at her father. He allowed himself a small, slow smile. She turned back to the banker. I'll think about it, Mr. Sterling, she said. I'll be in touch. He nodded, a gesture of true respect. I look forward to it. He and the sheriff turned their horses and rode away, leaving not a cloud of dust, but the quiet promise of a future. Music cue, the simple guitar melody returns, now fuller, joined by a quiet string section. It is a theme of triumph, not loud or boastful, but deep, resonant, and earned. The 900 bales were gone by the following summer. Vance's soil renewal was no longer a one-woman and her father operation. Eleanor had taken the loan. She hired a crew of 4 men, young men from town who were grateful for the steady work. She bought 2 sturdy wagons and a team of draft horses. Her father acted as foreman, his quiet authority respected by all. The ranch was transformed. The house Thomas built was now the heart of a bustling business. Wagons came and went, loaded with sacks of the dark, rich fertilizer that was transforming the entire region. The name Vance became synonymous not with tragedy, but with prosperity. Fields that had been barren for decades were now producing bumper crops of wheat and corn. Ranches that had been on the verge of collapse were now running healthy, fat cattle on rejuvenated pastureland. Eleanor never moved into town. She never remarried. The ranch was her home and her empire. She bought the old Abernathy Mill property from the township for back taxes and used the cavernous, empty building as her main bagging and storage facility. She signed contracts with other mills in other territories, having their useless shoddy shipped to her by the railroad car full. She turned a regional solution into a widespread industry. Mr. Sterling became a trusted advisor and a friend of a sort. He marveled at her business acumen, at her quiet, relentless drive. He never forgot the day he rode out to foreclose on her and ended up leaving as a supplicant. Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, Eleanor would sit on her porch, looking out over the fertile valley. She would take out Thomas's old notebook, its pages now soft and worn with use. She'd turn to the back, to the page with his hasty, brilliant thought. Good for the soil, maybe. Below his words, she had made her own entry in a neat, clear hand. It was the only addition she ever made to his book. It simply said, "It worked, Thomas." It all worked. The dust still settles on the valley. But now, when it does, it settles on rich, dark earth, on fields heavy with grain, on a town called Redemption that was saved not by a miracle, but by a woman who was told she couldn't move a mountain, and so decided to sell it, one sack at a time. So when they point to a mountain of someone else's trouble and call it a curse, what do you see? Do you see an ending, or do you see a beginning?